4, 3.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SCOTUS Crash Course live stream. And for those of you at home that don't remember what SCOTUS stands for, that's Supreme Court of the United States. This is Sabrina Williams with act.tv, and we have an amazing and informative live stream scheduled for you today. This live stream is being brought to you by several different partners, including People for the American Way, Vote Pro-Choice, and Blue Wave Voters. Rio, what are we doing here today? Why is this live stream so important?
Great, thanks Sabrina, and thanks to everyone watching at home. My name's Rio Tazwell with People for the American Way, and we're here today because we've assembled a number of experts to share some really important information and insight into the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. I'm sure folks are probably aware President Trump named someone named Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court for a lifetime appointment, and he's problematic for a whole range of reasons. So we've got some great folks who are going to come and share and answer some questions that we've actually gathered from folks about how Supreme Court really rules on so many different issues that are important to people, but also a little bit about how SCOTUS nominations work to give some insight into this somewhat wonky issue of Supreme Court nominations.
And Rio, which speakers can viewers expect to hear from today?
So we work with a whole broad range of organizations that are part of this coalition opposing Brett Kavanaugh. But today we're going to hear from some speakers from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, some of my colleagues here at People for the American Way, someone from NARAL, someone from Voto Latino, someone from Rock the Vote, and also someone from Young People for Action.
Now, I understand this Sunday, August 26th, is going to be a huge day of action. Can you tell our viewers a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So this coming Sunday, August 26th, there's going to be a massive day of action. People are protesting the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh in over 150 different towns and cities in all 50 states. So this is going to be a massive mobilization akin to the Women's March, the March for Our Lives, the March to Keep Families Together. The resistance is very much mobilizing around opposing Judge Brett Kavanaugh, and this Sunday is going to be a massive demonstration. If you want to find out about a rally that's happening near you, again, in 150 towns and cities all across the country, you can go to uniteforjustice2018.com, find out about a rally happening near you. This has been a collaboration of many large organizations that are coming together and organize these, so please get plugged in and tell your friends about it. It's going to be an awesome, incredible opportunity to show public opposition to Judge Brett Kavanaugh.
And if you have any questions during the live stream today, drop them in the comment section below, and we may try, if we have a few minutes at the end of the stream, we may try to answer them. Rio, why don't I have you introduce our very first guest?
Absolutely. So first we're going to be joined by Lena Swarnstein with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and she's going to answer our first set of questions.
Thank you, Rio, and thank you all so much for joining us. No matter what issue you care about, I guarantee to you that the Supreme Court has a direct impact on what that is. As Rio mentioned, I'm Lena Zwarnstein. I'm with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and we represent a coalition of more than 200 organizations that are working to make sure that the America is as good as its ideals. I thank you for joining us today and for asking us a number of questions. The question I have to answer is, what happened this week that impacted where senators stand in the Supreme Court fight? How did the civil and human rights organizations react to this news? And why have they been sounding the alarm on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court? So I know a number of my colleagues will be going into more depth about some of the particular issues that Brett Kavanaugh raises and the threats that he has to them. But I want to make clear that this week there was a clear indication that Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator who may have, at least allegedly, tried to illegally influence the outcome of his own presidential election. That is significant, but that really is a pattern of what we're seeing that this administration is doing in terms of its disregard for the laws, the rule of law, and so much that we care about. Really, this Supreme Court fight is a culmination of really what's at risk for our entire democracy. When Justice Kennedy announced that he was going to retire on June 27th, there was widespread panic, maybe, or at least certainly discontent amongst the civil and human rights community. So we have been sounding the alarm since then. President Trump has selected from a list of pre-vetted candidates who he has promised us would do things such as overturn Roe versus Wade and dismantle the Affordable Care Act, which provides coverage for health insurance to millions of Americans. What's at stake could not be greater. But we are also understanding that this administration, as well as the Senate majority, is trying to do everything that they can to rush through putting an out-of-touch political operative on the Supreme Court, someone who is much more likely to rule for the wealthy and powerful than all of us. So the civil and human rights community has been very unified in terms of opposing Brett Kavanaugh since day one. And Brett Kavanaugh's record is immense. He has been on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for 12 years. But before that, he was a political operative, someone that had been very involved in the Starr investigation regarding President Clinton's own impeachment. He received some political positions in the White House, counsel's office, as well as staff secretary. And what we know is that this administration is trying to do everything that they can to rush through this nomination without full information, and while this president is under a cloud of certainly a cloud of potential criminal activity as well for him and his operatives. So very quickly, I will say that senators this week, given the news of President Trump, really galvanized to sound the alarm. Really nothing more, as I said at the top, is at stake than just the actual democracy and the actual core institutions that help really make our country work. And so there has been a deliberate attempt ever since Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to hide a significant portion of his record. So, for example, traditionally in the Supreme Court confirmation process, both Republicans and Democrats work together to make sure that documents that the whole public, and the American public, can see what that particular nominee has raised concerns about or has opinions about in the past. But there's a deliberate effort to hide many of those records. And the Senate Republicans themselves have issued their own request that limits what types of records and documents that we, the American people, can actually see, and actually eliminates 3 years, the critical times where Brett Kavanaugh was staff secretary, that we know inform a lot of what he thinks, and that he himself has said has been most important for him to be to influence and to help inform how he is a judge. And I say this because a lot of that work goes directly to what the news this week in terms of the presidential investigation. Brett Kavanaugh has been on record saying that a president should not be under investigation or have any criminal or civil charges raised against them while in office. That's a problem because this Supreme Court, especially if he is confirmed, will be making decisions on major aspects, or could potentially be making decisions on major aspects of the investigation. Everything ranging from whether a special counsel or subpoena or anything else might be legitimate or called for. So as I mentioned, though, the civil and human rights community has been sounding the alarm because really everything is at stake. We, in addition to over 100 of our organizations, very early on issued our opposition because we know that his record on immigrant justice, on disability rights, on rights for working families, for women, for immigrants, and for so many are at risk. His record, both as a political operative and as a judge, shows that he is a direct threat to all of those. So the icing on the cake really is that this is all happening at a time where this administration is trying to seek a reward and put somebody on the bench who would be out of touch with all of us and only rule for the wealthy and powerful. So I want to turn it over to many of my other colleagues who have a lot of answers to more of your questions, but I know we appreciate you all being here, tuning in, taking action, and we know that together we can do what we can to oppose Kavanaugh. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Heidi Seek, the co-founder of Vote Pro Choice, and I'm here to talk to you about stopping Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. Am I smiling? I should definitely not be smiling. I'm here to answer all of your questions about why it's so important to stop Brett Kavanaugh from being confirmed to the Supreme Court. This question comes from the Blue Wave Voter Facebook group, which you all should be members of. Why is Brett Kavanaugh specifically a threat to women? Won't every Trump nominee be this bad? Yes, every Trump nominee will be bad, and we need to stop every single one that he could potentially nominate. But specifically, Brett Kavanaugh is so bad for women because we know from his record that he is absolutely against reproductive freedom. And we know that Trump has said that any Supreme Court justice that he nominates is going to be anti-choice, forced birth, whatever you want to call it. And this is going to be one of the worst nominations he's ever done. Let's talk about the history of reproductive freedom.
Hi, my name is Marge Baker. I'm the Executive Vice President of People for the American Way, and I want to welcome everyone to the Crash Course live stream on the Brett Kavanaugh nomination and why we are seriously concerned about that nomination and think that it needs to be opposed. I've been asked to address a number of questions that have come in about the logistics for the hearings on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination, including a question about what is the hearings process like for a Supreme Court nominee? And I want to get to that question in a minute, but I want to emphasize that there is nothing normal about this process for the Brett Kavanaugh nomination. Brett Kavanaugh is a nominee handpicked by outside groups with a political agenda to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and to gut Roe v. Wade. We have a White House colluding with Senate Republicans to hide Kavanaugh's record. Senator Leahy, one of the important Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee, has said this is the most incomplete, most partisan, and least transparent vetting process for any Supreme Court nominee in history. And then lastly, the reason why this is not normal. With the president implicated by his own lawyer in criminal activity, they are trying to ram through a nominee whose record shows that he believes the president should be above the law and not subject to criminal investigation or indictment. So I start out answering the question about what this hearings process is like, saying this is not normal, and we may not know exactly what's going to happen. But typically what happens in a Supreme Court hearing is that there's 4 days of hearings. The first day is devoted to opening statements from all the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. There are 21 members of the committee, and they'll each have about 10 minutes to do their opening statements. So for a good bit of time, we will hear from both Republicans and Democrats on the committee in terms of their opening views about this nomination. I think every single Republican on the committee has already announced their support for Kavanaugh, so you'll expect them to say good things about Kavanaugh being smart and kind and will come with an open mind. And you'll hear Democrats raising serious concerns about whether, in fact, he will have an open mind when he looks at cases, or whether he, in fact, is coming to the court with a political agenda, as those who picked him hoped was the case. So the first day will be hearing from the senators, and then after they're done, we'll hear from Brett Kavanaugh. He'll give an opening statement. Usually it's not that long. It depends on the nominee, but typically it's not terribly long. And then the Senate will recess. Then the next 2 days will be intense questioning from Republicans and senators and Democratic senators on the committee of Brett Kavanaugh. And I'll get to that in a minute, but those questions will last for, usually it's 2 days. It'll be a lengthy questioning, could go into the evening on Wednesday night, and then come back for more questions on Thursday. We expect the senators they can do several rounds of questioning, so we expect to see that. And then the last day of the hearings, which would be Friday, we will hear from outside panels of witnesses. And those panels have not yet been chosen, but I think we can expect to hear a number of witnesses who will talk about the harm that they think could have come upon them, their families, people, their loved ones, based on Kavanaugh's record, which you will hear much more about later on from other speakers. So the next question I got was, what should we be paying attention to during the hearings? What role do our senators play in the process? And I alluded to this a little bit. As I said, the Republican senators, you will expect to hear from them that Kavanaugh is smart, kind guy, will come to an open mind, just call balls and strikes, as now Justice Roberts said during his hearings. And the Democrats will say, you know, it's fine and good that he's a nice man, it's fine and good that he's bright, but what we really need to get to is whether or not he will come to cases before him with an open mind as opposed to a political agenda. And that's a political agenda on a range of issues. We know we don't have a lot of his records from when he was in the Bush White House, but the records we do have and his opinions give us enormous pause. Enormous pause, for example, as to whether or not he thinks Roe v. Wade was correctly decided, whether or not he thinks that the Affordable Care Act is constitutional, whether or not he thinks the president is above the law. He's got a number of writings that suggest he does not think a sitting president can be not just indicted, but can't even be criminally investigated. And that causes serious, serious concern. So you'll hear intense questioning from the senators as to this. And what you'll also look for is Kavanaugh won't answer the questions. We already know from report outs from meetings that Kavanaugh has had with a number of senators that he's not answering their questions. He's not telling us whether he thinks the Affordable Care Act is constitutional. He's not telling us whether he thinks Roe v. Wade was correctly decided. And unlike past hearings, expect to see a lot of back and forth in that. And I do not think the Democratic senators on the committee are going to accept a non-answer. Because it's unacceptable in this time. And I don't think they'll accept a non-answer on whether or not he thinks the president can be criminally charged, criminally indicted, or criminally investigated. So the next question I got was, if he's confirmed, does he become a justice immediately? And if he's rejected, what happens? So the process is there's hearings that, unless the hearings are halted, as a number of the Democrats, in fact, the entire membership of the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee have requested. If the hearings go forward on the 4th, then they will last till Friday of that week, and then what happens is the nomination has to get voted on by the committee, and that voting committee is likely to happen the week of the 17th. So there's a week in between the hearings and then the committee vote. There will be a committee vote that week. And then usually the nominee, if the nominee is voted out of committee, is reported, it's called reported to the floor for a vote by the full Senate in a few days. So the week of the 17th will be when there are votes. And if he is confirmed by the full Senate, he will be sworn in almost immediately. And typically there's a private swearing-in ceremony and then a more public swearing-in ceremony. But as we know, the goal is to try to get him on the court before October 1st, which is when the next Supreme Court term starts. Not sure if that's going to happen, not sure what's going to happen at the hearings. And then if he's rejected, then we go back to the drawing board. If he's rejected, then what happens is the Senate the White House has to come up with a new nominee. There will be hopefully more negotiations, because there were absolutely none about Brett Kavanaugh, between the White House, the majority, and the minority in the Senate to come up with a nominee who is more a bipartisan choice and more balanced. So that's essentially how the process will go, and remains to be seen what happens. A lot can happen between now and then. This is a nomination arc that has seen a lot of surprises, and I expect to see still more surprises, so we can't say for sure what's going to happen. And then the last question is about whether there's any way to remove a justice once they're confirmed. And this is a really, really, really good question, because what a lot of people don't realize is that federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, are confirmed for life. So when they take a seat, it is a lifetime appointment. They are there for life until they retire or until they pass away. The only way to remove them is through impeachment. And people know about the impeachment process. It's pretty much the same process as exists for other federal officials like the President of the United States. It's a very loose process. It's not been used very many times. The standard is very loose. Basically, federal judges have to be on good behavior. So it's hard to know what good behavior is, but in the past, when there have been impeachments, and there have been some impeachments of lower court judges, it's been for offenses like perjury or misuse of funds or some crime like that, bribery or something like that. So it's very, very, very hard to remove a justice of the Supreme Court, which is why so much energy is being invested in making sure that we get the right person on the court to fill this very, very, very critical seat. Justice Kennedy's seat is the swing seat on the court, and the justice who comes in to replace him can make decisions affecting people's lives and well-being and health for generations to come, which is why it needs so much attention. So those are the questions I have about what the logistics are. Again, I think the only thing I would end with is stay tuned, because I think this is one case where we're going to see a lot of things we haven't seen before, and also pay particular attention to what I think we will see from both activists on the outside and Democratic senators on the committee, is really painting a portrait of what the impact of this justice would be on real people and real people's lives. So thank you very much for joining us again. This is the Crash Course live stream on the Brett Kavanaugh nomination, and thank you very much for joining us.
Let's talk about the history of reproductive freedom in America. Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973 and gave abortion rights to everybody. But ever since then, thousands of bills have been passed in state legislatures across the country restricting our access. And this has been going on and on and on. And particularly after this administration was put in place, it's been accelerating. So access is continuing to be removed. So we're in a bad place now. This Supreme Court justice nomination and any future decisions that he might make about reproductive freedom is going to make it so much worse. Here's where there's hope. We know that 72% of American voters believe that there should be reproductive freedom in America. They know what's at stake. They know that our lives are at stake. They know that our freedom is at stake. That's what we do at Vote Pro-Choice, is that we provide all the information that you need to be able to vote pro-choice in every election. So sign up for your nationwide voter guide at voteprochoice.us. There are 45,000 races on the ballot in November, and we need to make sure that we're voting pro-choice in every single one.
Hi, thank you for tuning in to our SCOTUS Crash Course live stream. I'm Kate Ryan with NARAL Pro-Choice America, and I'm representing our 2 million member activists who are out in the streets fighting to protect and advance reproductive freedom. So I've got a couple questions here that I'll answer. First question I actually really love: why is Brett Kavanaugh specifically bad for women? I love this question because it's easy to answer. Brett Kavanaugh is clearly hostile to women's reproductive freedom, and we know that for a few reasons. His own record, every chance he has gotten while on the bench, he's currently a judge, he has ruled against women. He has ruled to force a young woman to carry a pregnancy against her will. He has ruled to allow bosses to interfere in women's insurance coverage of birth control because their boss objected to it. This is the kind of person that's been nominated by President Trump to the court. We also know, because of who he's been nominated by and why, President Trump has been explicit about his goal of only nominating justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade automatically. They're his own words. He and Pence want to criminalize abortion. Trump has explicitly said he thinks women should be punished for having an abortion. And we know because of who is supporting Kavanaugh's nomination. The groups that are supporting him are explicitly anti-choice. Their goal is explicitly to end Roe v. Wade and criminalize abortion. And they are not only cheering his nomination, but spending tens of millions of dollars to get him confirmed. And we don't actually have to guess that that's why. They've explicitly said that the end of Roe is in sight because Trump nominated Kavanaugh. So that is definitely why he will be bad for women. The second question I have is also a really great question. I live in a blue state with blue senators. How can I help? Perfectly reasonable thing. Every senator needs to be out in opposition, and not everyone is yet. Even though there are many Democratic senators we expect to be a no, they haven't all said that explicitly, and it is important that they do. We need a united Democratic caucus because we also need 2 Republican votes. We can get them, but we do need the Dem caucus out. So please, please call your senators, tell them not only to come out as a no vote, but talk to their colleagues who aren't out yet, talk to their Republican colleagues. It is essential that this not be treated as business as usual, and senators should pull out all the stops. The other thing that you can do is show up at a Unite for Justice event this Sunday on August 26th. There will be events in all 50 states, nearly 200 events. It's being partnered with 75 organizations. UniteForJustice.com. Go there, see where the event is in your state. Senators need to see people taking to the streets to demonstrate that we know that our fundamental rights and freedoms are on the line with this Kavanaugh nomination. And the last question I have is there really any hope of stopping Kavanaugh? And that's really the money question, right? And the answer is yes. If we fight, we will win. The president chose a weak nominee. He is actually, according to polling, the weakest nominee for SCOTUS in history. He has worse numbers in terms of who supports him than nominees that have been withdrawn in the past. And that's the thing. Just because he is a nominee does not mean he'll be confirmed. Supreme Court nominees have failed and been withdrawn, and we can do that again now. He is an extremist. He is someone who would twist the Constitution to suit his own ideological agenda. He would criminalize abortion and punish women. We also know that he is nominated by a president who does not have a legitimate right to nominate the next Supreme Court justice. This is a president who has been implicated in federal crimes. And it's essential that we make that clear and we can win. So this is our opportunity to kind of change course for history so that in a post-Trump administration, we won't have lost our rights in the course of that time. So I'm going to actually turn it over to the next speaker. So thank you for tuning in, and please stay tuned.
Okay, so the reality is that this Supreme Court nominee is so regressive, and this administration is so regressive, they're going to take us back to the past. It'll be kind of like going back to the 80s. Do you remember the 80s? 80s? Yeah, it was like weird. Bad hair. My hair was really big in the 80s. And bad television, television, and a lot of MTV. The 80s was Ronald Reagan. Let's just sit there with that. Ronald Reagan. But you know what it was like for women?
But the court's decision paves the way for states to formulate their own guidelines, which could significantly reduce the easy access women have had for the past 16 years.
I am convinced Roe will fall by the end of this presidential term, and child killing will be driven back to hell where it came from.
Recent attacks on abortion clinics all over the country have prompted the House to open hearings on the problem. Congress hopes to find ways to get tough with overzealous anti-abortionists.
The most celebrated anti-abortion protests have been abortion clinic bombings.
Abortion clinics were bombed in the 80s, kind of like they are now to some extent, but more than. And you know what else? If you got federal funding, like Planned Parenthood, you couldn't actually talk about abortion. There was a gag rule back then. So it's like, shh, you couldn't tell the truth. That's crazy. So you really want to go back to the 80s? Like, you remember the movies? Like Desperately Seeking Susan and Weird Science and Breakfast Club. Well, actually, I really like those movies. Do you remember Back to the Future? The guy Biff? Did you know he was based on Donald Trump? That's true. He was actually based on Donald Trump. Remember the lying, cheating bully?
This way Biff became president.
Yeah. You really want to go back there? I don't think so.
Hi, everybody. So excited to be here. Jessica Reeves, COO of Vote Latino. Huge thank you to act.tv and People for the American Way for putting this together. But I'm here to answer a couple of questions on at the SCOTUS Crash Course live stream. So first question is, how does Brett Kavanaugh feel about immigrants? How could he affect our crisis at the border? There's a couple examples here that I think we can point to that show the general feeling of this Supreme Court nominee. First one I want to highlight is the case of a young immigrant girl, teen, who came to this country seeking the American dream. She was detained and through routine physical exams found out that she was unexpectedly and unwantedly pregnant. She sought an abortion, and it was a very hard earned case in the courts, but eventually she was granted the right to make her own choices about her body. In a scathing dissent, Brett Kavanaugh shared that as an undocumented immigrant, that she maybe shouldn't be entitled to the same rights as citizens, which in this case is especially disturbing as an underage teen coming on her own. So I think that's one example. Another example is in the case of a meat packaging company in Brooklyn, there was a case of a group of workers seeking to unionize. Eventually, through also a hard-fought case, they were able to gain that right. Again, in unexpected or unnecessary dissent, Brett Kavanaugh shared his views, really highlighting the fact that he didn't believe undocumented workers had the same rights as other workers in this country. So while they're performing the same jobs, working alongside other workers who sought to unionize, they were seen as less than people in this case, which is very disturbing. I'll go ahead and go to the next question. Our population begins to grow more diverse every year, but our courts are taking a hard turn towards conservatism. What effect does this have on communities of color and immigrants? So I think this is a great question. While our country continues to grow more and more diverse, demographics are not destiny. So we really need to focus on ensuring that some of our most vulnerable communities, in many cases, communities of color and immigrant communities, are not left out of the conversation and are not left in the shadows. So we really need to focus on ensuring that we have representation, not only diverse representation that understands these communities of color, but diverse representation in all levels of government that can understand the needs of different communities and are really going to represent the people. Today, looking at Gen Z, Gen Z is the most diverse community our country has ever, or the most diverse generation our country has ever seen. So while our Latino community, our Asian American community, a lot of these groups continue to grow, it's only going to get more diverse. And if we don't take their rights and their needs and values into consideration now, we're going to have a widening gap of community access and are going to be much less inclusive and I think steer away from what makes America great. So that's it for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in, but please stay tuned. You have some great speakers coming up next in a short while. So thanks very much.
The thing we know for sure is that we cannot go back to the past. I mean, the past is here, actually. So let's walk through a scenario. Brett Kavanaugh gets appointed to the Supreme Court. Certain abortion bans that have been passed in the states flow through the appeals process in the courts. It could hit the Supreme Court as soon as this next session. And that means that by spring, we could lose Roe v. Wade. That's scary in and of itself. But do you know what's even scarier? There are 4 states that already have what are called trigger laws on the books, which means that when Roe v. Wade is overturned, abortion is immediately illegal in those states. And I want to talk you through, particularly Louisiana, what happens in Louisiana. They already have a law in the books that says 10 days after Roe v. Wade is overturned, abortion becomes illegal. If you help someone get an abortion, or if you're a doctor that provides an abortion, that is a felony charge, $100,000 fine, and you're sent to 10 years of hard labor camp. This is right now. Right now. Not some dystopian future, not some unknown past. That could be what happens now. Blessed day.
Thank you for tuning in to the SCOTUS Crash Course live stream. I'm Shanice Simmons with Rock the Vote. I'm answering question number 1. So, we know the Supreme Court picks have consequences for generations. What does this newer generation coming up have to be concerned about? So, the Supreme Court Justice nomination is a permanent choice that will strongly influence the future of this country. Young people will have to live with the results of this nomination. The future of voting rights, women's rights, reproductive health, and civil liberties are at risk. Question number 2. What is the Supreme Court's role in our democracy and how elections work? The Supreme Court is the highest, most important court in the entire judicial branch. The Constitution gives the Supreme Court power to check, if necessary, the actions of the President and Congress. They can tell the President his actions are not allowed by the Constitution, and Congress, a law passed, is no longer constitutional. The President nominates justices to the court, and the Senate must vote to approve those nominations. This is one of the most important and crucial roles in our democracy. And it is important to have a Supreme Court that represents the values of young people and a court that is balanced. Stay tuned for more. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for watching. The thing we know for sure is that we cannot go back to the past. Thank you for watching. Just the fact that you're trying to educate yourself and figure out what to do just gives me hope, and it gives all of us hope. Because here's the thing, we can win this. We really can. We can stop Kavanaugh. People are asking, what do we do? What do we do? Yes, and we actually have lots of things that we all need to be doing. So we know, call your senators, and we know specific senators that we need to focus on. It's North Dakota and Maine and Indiana and Alabama. We got to make sure that guy votes right. And Pennsylvania would be a good place to call, and maybe even Arizona. Basically, call your senators. I mean, they need to all hear from you, and you have to tell them how important it is. So that's one. Number 2, we got to take to the streets. August 26th, Unite for Justice Day of Action. That's where we're going to get out there and show our power. But then number 3, we also have to be voting pro-choice in every election all the time. That's what our voter guide is for. So sign up to receive it at voteprochoice.us. We can win this, but we have to take all the action we can.
Hello, my name is Cece Battle, and I'm the director of Young People For. I'm here representing over 1,900 young people in all 50 states and territories who are working to address issues in their community. So my first question is, what are some ways in which the Supreme Court particularly affects young people, women, and people of color? So first, y'all, the 9 judges on the Supreme Court are what we say is the moral compass of the nation, who shape everything from marriage to money to safety and sex for the entire nation. Decisions that this court makes impacts lives for generations, and young people will be around for generations, so therefore it affects us pretty gravely. Young people and women and people of color stand to lose the most because our social, economic, and political futures are at stake. And these judges in the courts dictate whether we matter in the eyes of the law, as it is their job to interpret the Constitution. What we must remember is that equal protection of all people, specifically people of color and women, was not a consideration when the Constitution was originally written. So who interpret those laws is super important. So with many of the advances that we have made in the nation in equal protection for our folks as marginalized communities have been led by the courts, not by political branches throughout history. For instance, Loving versus Virginia, which protect the rights to marry regardless of race, was a big deal for us. Roe versus Wade, which we are all familiar with. And Tinker versus Desmones, which protects constitutional rights of students in U.S. public schools, including free speech, and set guidelines for whether schools' disciplinary actions violate the Constitutions. So courts have not only provided protection, but they have been pivotal in providing access to rights that we should have had in the first place. It is also important to note that our Supreme Court is not only impacting women, girls, and people of girls in this country, but also due to our influence in the U.S., it also impacts folks in other nations around the world. So protecting our court is not only critical for this nation, but critical for the world. The second question, how can the Supreme Court nomination fight be used to elevate and address critical issues of privilege and oppression? So it's very difficult to name the systems that contribute to oppression that communities of color face. Many are just starting to make those connections because most language and institutions have been inaccessible over time. It is crucial that we use this conversation around the Supreme Court to highlight the impact that the court has on not just cases that can be seen as words on a paper, but real lives and people's stories. We must all remember that these court cases are life and death for people, and specifically people of color and women. It is important that we use all of the tools in our toolbox in order to resist oppressive structures, policies, and people. The judges appointed to the Supreme Court will serve for a lifetime, and as Marge, I know she mentioned earlier, either they can retire or pass away. So who's on this court, whether, their rulings will decide whether in our favor or against us, the decisions made are critical for our progression. We also should know that conservatives get it, right? They understand the power of courts and have taken a deliberate strategy to nominate extremely conservative judges that will make conservative interpretations of the Constitution. We must use this conversation around the Supreme Court nominations to not only talk about life and death for people, but to highlight the untold stories of how we in communities of color are impacted by these decisions. That's why we at YP4, as well as amazing other partners, have started a campaign called Our Courts, Our Lives. So if you're on social media, look at the hashtag Our Courts, Our Lives and join us in that conversation. If you're trying to figure out how do I join this fight and how do I engage in this critical conversation about illuminating oppression, please join us by sharing your stories at hashtag Our Courts, Our Lives. And by participating in this campaign, what we're doing is sending a clear message that we understand courts matter, and we're going to make sure that we have judges that will stand up for our lives. Thank you. Once again, my name is Cece Battle, representing Young People 4, and I'm going to pass it back to Rio.
Thank you so much, Cece. Wow, did we have a great live stream today or what? So for those of you who are just tuning in, or just as a reminder, you have been watching the SCOTUS Crash Course live stream brought to you by many, many partners, including People for the American Way, Vote Pro-Choice, Blue Wave Voters, and many others. So Rio, just as a recap for folks who are just tuning in and may want to go back and rewatch this live stream, what have we been talking about today?
Thanks, Sabrina. So we've been giving folks some perspective on some of the critically important issues that Supreme Court decisions influence in American life. So we're talking about, a woman's right to choose, have bodily autonomy. We're talking about issues of privilege and oppression, how the Supreme Court particularly impacts people of color and young people and women. We're also talking about how the Supreme Court impacts the lives of immigrants, but this is really just a microcosm of a vast array of issues that the Supreme Court touches, whether it's workers' rights or the environment, really you name it, any aspect of life the Supreme Court touches in one way or another. So our guests today have given sort of a snapshot look at some of the most pertinent issues that are on the table with this Supreme Court fight. But one of the other things that we covered in this live stream was the process by which Supreme Court nominations happen. So Marge Baker, which is our boss here at People for the American Way, gave some insight into how these nominations happen and what to expect during the hearings that are coming up really soon. As folks may know, Brett Kavanaugh is slated to have hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee the first week of September. And it's critically important that we get people aware of what that process is going to look like so that we can influence and ultimately, hopefully, stop this nomination, which is ultimately achievable.
So we definitely want to stop Brett Kavanaugh. I understand there's a huge day of action this Sunday, August 26th. Tell us more about it and tell the viewers how they can get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So this Sunday, August 26th, there's a massive day of action in almost 200 towns and cities all across the country in all 50 states. People are going to be protesting the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, showing public opposition to this horrendous Supreme Court nominee. You can get plugged in by going to uniteforjustice2018.com. That's uniteforjustice2018.com. Get plugged in with an event near you, and be sure to let your friends know. make plans to show up to these rallies on Sunday. It's critical that we have an enormous demonstration of public opposition to Brett Kavanaugh. And one other thing that I want to encourage people to do is to call your senator. It's absolutely essential that we have our elected representatives, particularly in the Senate, with this Supreme Court fight, given that it's the Senate's role to advise and consent in Supreme Court nominations. We need to make sure that our senators hear from their constituents opposition to Brett Kavanaugh. It doesn't matter if you live in a red state or a blue state. We need to get all the Democrats unified behind the opposition to Brett Kavanaugh and peel off just one or two Republicans. So it doesn't matter where you live. Call your senator and tell them that you oppose Brett Kavanaugh. You can reach them at the Capitol switchboard. I'm going to give you that number right now. We'll also post it on the live stream. So be sure to take a little time out of your day and call, and keep on calling. We need to really blow up the phone lines over there. The number is 202-224-3121. That's 202-224-3121. Perhaps that's the most important thing to do, but also show up for those rallies on Sunday.
So thank you again for watching this SCOTUS Crash Course live stream brought to you by several partners, Vote Pro-Choice, Blue Wave Voters, and People for the American Way. Again, find an action in your area this Sunday, August 26th, and don't forget to call your senator and tell them that you do not want Brett Kavanaugh to be on the Supreme Court for life. Thank you again for watching. This is Sabrina Williams with ACT.tv.